Well, in the course of any conversation revolving around the provision of government services and whether or not the government should provide more or less of them or provide them at all, one is inevitably confronted with the accusation that if the government weren't to provide those services, then presumably nobody would. Um, the um, plea most commonly heard, and it's kind of a cliche in-joke for libertarians at this point, is, but who will build the roads? Now, first off, this argument usually belies, just to make this argument, belies an enormous ignorance of history. Because any service you can name, whether it's roads, canals, defense, law, justice, even defense against foreign militaries, we can find, both in history and in contemporary society, examples of it being provided by non-state agents, either within societies that are stateless or within state societies where the state simply does not provide this or that service. Now, arguments can be made about, if how applicable the provision of, say, Nordic law and Viking Age Iceland would be to today's society, or defense services in Somalia to a modern Western country, certainly, but to just assume that they can't exist at all is patently false. Um, and that's the implicit. The other implicit assumption is that somehow the non-government provision of a resource or good or service should be more or less identical to the state provision, and if it's not, then that is prima facie evidence that it's a failure. Of course, this argument assumes that the current provision of these services by the government is idealized in some sense, and I don't think that can be argued. In fact, there's quite a few people who aren't radical libertarians who reach that conclusion for this or that provision of a service. So there's lots of people who are reformers for all kinds of government provisions of goods, whether it be education or healthcare or defense or roads, who realize that any attempt to reach an objective rubric to decide the efficacy of the provision of a good or service inevitably reaches the conclusion that the government is doing it less than optimally. That is, unless you assume that the optimal provision of a good or service is whatever the government says that it is. And although people make arguments that imply that all the time, they very seldomly make that explicit because it is, of course, ridiculous. Um, but be that as it may, I think that there's a good contemporary example that shows how ludicrous this is, because right now in our society, there is a good or a service, depending on how you want to call it, that is provided for free to everybody. The consumer has enormous choice, uh, even in the smallest localities. The variation of what's available is astronomical. The infrastructure required to maintain and supply this good and service, and the personnel entailed in that, is a gigantic affair, and yet it's not provided by the government. And that service, and I could name others here, but I think one that people fail to realize is the provision of religious goods and services, churches, essentially, in the United States. There is probably closer to a free market in religion in the United States than there is to anything else. I don't think we can say there's 100% a free market. At some level, if you have a lot of revenue, the state wants to get a license to be a church, um, so that you can't just have a factory and say that you're a church and not pay any taxes, that sort of thing. And of course, this is abhorrent and terrible and pointless. They do award this license very easily. Doesn't really cost anything as far as I'm aware. It is recognized, and the result is that there's enormous religious diversity. This is actually an insight that I have heard referenced many times by objectivists. Objectivists are very interesting because if they're pretty mainstream and they're pretty close to Rand, i.e., they're not anarcho post Randian objectivists, of which there's more than a few. Um, Old school mainstream objectivists have a very nationalistic pro-America. America's the greatest, most reasonable country ever. Yet they're also atheists, and so they tend to have this kind of identity crisis where America's great, but America's also by far the most religious of all the Western nations. It might be the most religion The most common rubric I've seen is it's the most religious country in the world, save India. I think that's probably mostly because India has so many more people. I don't know how you can really measure devoutness, so maybe that's ridiculous. It certainly has more church adherents, though, than any place in Europe, any Western place. Maybe some of us. I think Malta probably has more Catholics per capita, but whatever. Um, and there, I've seen Mr. Cropper and a few others debate this, and basically their conclusion is the reason there's so much religious power in the United States is because there is more or less a free market in religion. Or if we go to Europe, it's certainly not the case. This is one of the take it for granted libertarian positions that exists in the United States that doesn't exist in Europe. I was just talking to one of my new Swedish ANCAP friends, and he was describing how most of the people in Sweden are atheist. He was an atheist, and yet they still are officially members of a church, the state church, which is some kind of Lutheran Swedish denomination, and that they pay taxes to that church. And that when he was in college, he decided to leave the church. His parents, who were both atheists, argued against this because it's just the traditional thing that you're supposed to do, and Sweden has a conformity problem apparently, and he had to basically submit in writing, in a very official sense that I found quite alien and surprising, that he wanted to leave this church, and then of course his taxes were adjusted. They probably, if he sees this or any other Swedes watches, I don't know if his total taxes were actually reduced or if they just said, okay, now you got to pay a different tax. He mentioned something about a death tax, so I don't know all the details. But as the objectivists note, in Europe, the state is in a union with the churches are state subsidized. They receive tax monies. This is true in Germany. This is true in the Anglican Church. I don't know how I can't say that I know how it's divided everywhere, but they're state churches. And you would think if you were a statheist or statist or an interventionist that, well, look, even a protectionist, even these people say, well, if the government would have better industry if the government protected this or that industry. They have that in Europe for religion, for this or that religion, and their churches are empty, the cathedrals are empty, and people don't believe it. And then you juxtapose that with the United States, where there's no state subsidy, really. I mean, we could debate in some really vague sense, but if there is, it's infinitesimally small. And don't tell me because George Bush was president, please. Um, and yet there's this enormous cornucopia of things that are available, of choices. And I think that is probably the single greatest explanation for the difference in the vibrancy between the religious life in the United States and that in Western Europe, especially, but Europe generally. Um, I think about it like this. Um, Churches, for all their wealth and all their power, they are not even providing any goods or services in the sense that most people need. Um, you don't even if you're religious, you don't have to go to a church and you don't have to pay anything. You can just be in a prayer group. When I was in college, I had lots of friends who were in, basically, they consider themselves quote unquote charismatic Christians. And I would go to their meetings, and they weren't paying tithes, and they weren't going to buildings or anything. They were just doing that on their own. But that contributed to their religious life. And those people are probably, for most of them, not all of them, are going to continue to be religiously active because they found a sect, I guess, that really could really fit their niche, what they were looking for. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't heresy. They didn't have to change their tax status or anything like that. On the other hand, if you like all the pomp and circumstance of stained glass windows, pews, and the idolatry of Catholicism, that's open to you as well. So the choices, the choices available are just ridiculous. Even in very small towns, there'll be lots of different churches and other religious denominations and activities that don't even register as church activities, and yet this is all without them selling anything. They're not selling potatoes or food or electricity or water or sewers. They're selling something extremely nebulous. Your soul, the afterlife. Most churches, I think, have a very strong social element. There's a theological element and there's a social element, and depending on who you're talking to, many churchgoers are just socialites. some people who go to church, it's all about theology, the Bible, the Bible, the Bible, philosophy, all that. Uh, but pretty much everyone's going to be a mix of the two. But here they're able to flourish and have all these buildings that they're able to keep maintained and to keep active and to. I mean, some of them have, many of them have huge amounts of money, and yet they're not actually providing anything. Now, I think the lesson here is that we should have a free market in everything, not just in churches. Imagine how much more variety we would have in all the other provisions of goods and services if they were as regulated, or in fact unregulated, as the religious life is today. Just imagine if we had regulation of churches the way we do of, say, providers of food, where, or God forbid, medical care, where if you wanted to become a preacher, let's say, you had to go to medical school for 12 years and pay $300,000, where they would only allow so many people per year to even get the thing. And they'd only allow the provision of the service in a few municipalities that decide to allow there to be one or two hospitals. The small churches, the innumerable number of individualized sects of religion would not be able to fund a preacher to do that. And so they would not legally exist. They would have to become black market churches. And depending on how ruthless the state was going to enforce, I mean, it's one thing if they had the laws in the states, like, we're not going to enforce it. That would be great too. But we've got a nice puritanical state that likes to enforce laws. That's the whole point, is so it has a reason to aggress against the people. So it has some way to blackmail them. If everything's legal, they have nothing to throw us in prison for. We're not going to be good tax cattle. There has to be some kind of pretext to keep throwing us behind bars. So if there was going to be regulation of religion, then they would be throwing people in jail. And historically, it's worse than that. They burn you at the stake or torture you or whatever else, including here in the United States. Um, I don't think they ever did any burnings here, but they tortured people to death. Although that's overblown by the liberals. Um, People would not be able to. All the small denominations would be eliminated. The larger denominations would have a dearth of practitioners, because instead of having millions of people trying their hand at providing religious services, which is what we have right now, there would only be that sliver of the population that was able to get the licensure. And so there would be that much less dynamism, that much less competition, and the consumers would be served that much less, and these consumers would go away and do other things. This is something that you can get around without paying, all right? But then it's fine in an institution like churches. I mean, if we were going to have a monopoly on something, it might as well be churches, if you're going to ask me. If you're an atheist, or I consider myself agnostic, whatever. I would rather have a monopoly in that than something that provides, say, food or medicine or roads or defense. And we don't have a monopoly in defense because private use of defense, and not to mention security agencies, is recognized um, on the most for the most part anyway. But I would like to see the amount of competition and dynamism that we have in our religious life in every other industry, in the provision of every other good and service. We would have that much more choice, that much more competition, that much higher quality goods. And that's just the regulation aspect. I compare regulations. If people bitch about taxes, and rightfully so, taxes are like a weight on you. They make everything more onerous, and people on the margins can't do it anymore. So if you have someone who's just getting by, a tax burden will get it so that they can't get by any longer. Whereas regulations are more like a straitjacket. Even if they're not that heavy, they can bind people's hands to the point where they can drown. They can't get around. They can't defend themselves. Or they become vulnerable far below, in a way that their mass or their physical strength would not entail. And so, regulations, I think, are actually even worse. Of course, they usually entail their own costs. Regulations are actually probably on the same order of magnitude as taxes when it comes to the costs of imposing them. It is difficult to calculate, and it depends which regulation we're comparing to which taxes and which industries. But you put them both together, and we have we have a parasite that is robbing us of probably more than half of our strength and diverting it to its ends. It's not a provision of goods and services that some omniscient being has determined would be the best for everybody, although that is the implicit assumption in most arguments in favor of retaining the current level of government intervention in this or that industry. How dare you think that we have less government involved in schools? Don't you know that the current government regulation and subsidization of education is the ideal one, and any deviation from that is objectively wrong? I've never heard anyone phrase it that way, but if they question cutting subsidies or changing the amount of regulations allowing for homeschooling or private schooling, then I don't see they kind of have to have that assumption, or at least I would think so. Um, the, the diversion of resources to this institution, which empirically is serving its own interests. If you do the acid test, if something is in the interests of the people and some Benthamite, if we were to come up with some objective Benthamite, most good for the most people, um, assuming you could create such a theory, what are the chances that the government is actually adhering to it? Pretty low, because the government is usually adhering to what's best for it. And so the expropriation from our wealth is not going to serve our interests as well as it would if we were able to dispose of our income as we saw fit. If we were to have the freedom that we have in religion, or not to have religion for that matter, uh, then we would be far better off if we were to extend that principle to everything else in our lives. So, uh, and I think this is a good example because it's something obviously, if I were to go to someone, we're going to have an institution that's going to cover the entire country, and we'll have thousands of different companies providing it, and they'll range in size from one person to millions and tens of millions of people, and they'll have millions, probably hundreds of thousands, or maybe even in the low millions of structures, ranging from giant factories, and they'll have hedge funds, and they'll go and they'll do outreach into other countries and blah blah blah, and there'll be no government regulation at all, and no compulsion for anybody to utilize this good or service. And people would say, well, that's impossible, that could never happen. But that's what we have right now in every town in America, multiple times. Uh, that's the reality, and that's something that's not even selling a good or a service. It's just some Bronze Age philosophy myth thing that lots of people like, but they're not coerced to buy or to patronize, and that's a good thing. The fact that we can opt out of a religion, that actually makes it so that they have to compete. That's another, the difference with the European. The Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't have to worry about how appealing his fucking stupid religion is, because he's going to get tax money either way. All right, but here in the United States, if what you're spouting is not appealing to your parishioners, then you won't make any money doing it. And so you have to curtail your message. And so the preachers in the United States, the competitiveness of them relative to their European counterparts, it's not even worth mentioning. It's orders of magnitude different. And I would like to see that competition and everything else, not just this one sliver of our society, albeit a fairly large sliver. So uh, that's my view on that. We don't yeah, we don't need the government to build our churches, and we don't need the government to build our. I mean, what's the idea here? Um, well, if the government wasn't subsidizing religion, then no one would be religious. Apparently not. Or the even more absurd assumption that if the government didn't if the government didn't provide our food, we would all just starve to death. Really? Do you think that if you were starving, that you would say, "Gosh, unless we get to vote and democracy provides this for me, I'm just going to starve to death." It's impossible to provide without the government. This is as ridiculous as the view that the Pharaoh's life is necessary for the sun to rise and the Nile to flood. It's just as ridiculous. Only way more people die now because of that than ever did in ancient Egypt. Um, if people have a reason to travel, if it's something that they value, then there is an incentive for others, including or the person themselves, to develop transit methods, whether that be roads or rail or canals or ships or transporter beams or whatever else. And so to assume then that they won't exist is ridiculous. To assume that they maybe will exist, but that they won't exist in the way you think is best, then you need to have some kind of objective way to determine what you think is best and how it is, and then measure the state against that. The profit and loss system, to me, based on voluntary exchange, is the only one that makes any sense that I've ever seen. I've heard people make arguments that imply some kind of objective standard, but they never actually delineate what that is. So until they can do that, and until they can do that to the point where that objective standard is better than the market, I don't give a shit about their objections about what will or will not be done without the government.